The Gilded Spire was not merely a restaurant. It was a testament to power, a throne room suspended 70 floors above the sprawling metropolis of New York City. The air itself seemed different here, filtered and rarefied, carrying the scent of old money, truffled oils, and the subtle, clean fragrance of freshly printed currency changing hands in the hushed corners. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped the space, transforming the city below into a silent, glittering tapestry of light and ambition. Inside, chandeliers dripped with crystal, mimicking frozen constellations, their light catching the polished gold leaf accents on the walls and the deep, rich grain of the mahogany tables. The soundscape was a carefully curated symphony of restraint. The gentle clinking of silver cutlery against fine porcelain, the muted murmur of conversations about billion-dollar mergers and political endowments, and the whisper-soft footsteps of the staff, who moved with the ghostly efficiency of those trained to be present but unseen. It was a world built to insulate its inhabitants from the grit and struggle of the city it lorded over, a gilded cage for the titans of industry. Elara Vance was a part of this meticulously crafted illusion, a ghost in a crisp, black uniform. Her movements were a study in economy and grace, each step precise, each gesture perfected through years of forced practice. She could refill a water glass without a single drop disturbing the surface, clear a table with the silent swiftness of a shadow, and maintain a facade of pleasant neutrality that betrayed nothing of the storm raging within her. To the patrons of the Gilded Spire, she was simply a pair of hands, a functional component of the restaurant's seamless operation. They looked through her, their gazes sliding off her form as if she were made of glass. They did not see the mind behind her eyes, a mind that had once orchestrated the evacuation of 207 people from a chemical inferno. They did not see the quiet, unyielding strength in the set of her jaw, a resilience forged not in boardrooms but in the chaos of a disaster that had stolen her future and crippled her family. Her hands, now expertly polishing a wine glass until it gleamed, remembered the feel of a tactical radio, the frantic push of buttons as she relayed coordinates through a haze of static and screams. Her eidetic memory, a gift that had once made her a prodigy at MIT, was now a curse, replaying the events of the Viridian Cascade with perfect, agonizing clarity. 10 years had passed, but she could still smell the acrid, metallic tang of the chemical cloud, still hear the strained voice of the fire chief asking for atmospheric data she was providing in real time, still feel the bone-deep terror of knowing thousands of lives rested on her calculations. The greatest victory of her life had become the anchor of her ruin. The toxic fallout from that corporate negligence had settled in her younger brother's lungs, leaving him with a chronic respiratory illness that chained him to oxygen tanks and a mountain of medical bills that grew higher with every labored breath he took. This job, this daily exercise in invisibility and humiliation, was for him. Every condescending glance she endured, every dismissive wave of a hand, was a coin she collected to pay for the care he desperately needed. The serene atmosphere of the restaurant fractured with the arrival of Julian Croft. It was not an entrance, it was a conquest. The maître d', a man who carried himself with the stiff dignity of a retired general, practically bowed, his composure melting into a sycophantic puddle. Croft moved through the space as if he owned it, which, in a way, he did. He was the CEO of Croft Holdings, the parent company of the Viridian chemical plant, and his very presence radiated an aura of untouchable power and profound arrogance. He was dressed in a bespoke suit of such a dark, expensive blue it seemed to absorb the light around him, a stark contrast to the brilliant, $10,000 watch on his wrist. His face was a mask of chiseled, philanthropic concern, an image carefully constructed by a team of public relations experts. But his eyes, small and sharp, missed nothing and valued no one. They swept across the room, cataloging assets and dismissing liabilities, and when they briefly passed over Elara, there was not a flicker of recognition. She was just another piece of furniture in his world. He was not alone. A small coterie of reporters and assistants trailed in his wake, setting up cameras and microphones with a quiet urgency. Croft had commandeered the most coveted section of the restaurant, the corner with the panoramic view of the skyline, for a televised interview. It was the 10th anniversary of the Viridian Cascade, and he was here to cement his legacy, to polish the fabricated narrative of his heroism for a national audience. Ilara was assigned to his table, a cruel twist of fate that felt like a deliberate jab from the universe. As she approached to offer water, Croft didn't look at her. He simply raised a hand, a gesture of impatient dismissal aimed at the manager. His voice was smooth, a low baritone dripping with false modesty for the benefit of the nearby microphone. He was a master manipulator, and this restaurant was his stage. Ilara felt a familiar coldness settle in her stomach, a frigid knot of rage and resignation she had learned to swallow down like bile. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. This is a story you won't want to miss, a tale of justice served in the most unexpected of ways. The lights of the city outside seemed to dim in comparison to the artificial glare of the television cameras now focused solely on one man's face, a face that had haunted Ilara's waking moments and stalked her nightmares for a decade. The interview was about to begin, and with it, the careful, deliberate retelling of a history that had been scrubbed clean of its true heroes and its most damning villains, leaving only the polished, self-aggrandizing fiction Croft had paid millions to create. The interview began, and Croft launched into his performance. He spoke of the unforeseen tragedy, the heavy burden of leadership, and the sleepless nights he spent in his penthouse command center, coordinating the response. He dabbed the corner of his eye with a silk handkerchief, a perfectly timed gesture of sorrow that the cameras captured in tight close-up. He painted a picture of himself as a reluctant hero, a captain who refused to abandon his ship, a man who had personally overseen every critical decision. The reporters listened with rapt attention, their pens scratching across notepads, recording his lies as gospel. From her station a few feet away, Ilara stood perfectly still, a silent statue in a black uniform, forced to bear witness to the desecration of her own history. Each word he spoke was a grain of salt, rubbed into a wound that had never been allowed to heal, a fresh layer of dirt shoveled onto the graves of the truth and the lives his negligence had shattered. Then came the moment that shattered her composure. The reporter asked him about the most critical decision made that day, the one that prevented the chemical plume from engulfing a nearby elementary school. Croft leaned forward, his face a mask of solemn remembrance. He spoke of a gut feeling, an instinct that told him the wind patterns were shifting faster than the models predicted. He described in vivid, fabricated detail how he had personally gotten on the comms, overriding the bureaucratic hesitation of the first responders, and ordered the rerouting of a school bus carrying 40 children, just minutes before their route would have taken them directly into the heart of the toxic cloud. He called it a moment of divine intervention, guided by his hand. But as he spoke, Ilara was no longer in the restaurant. She was back in the makeshift command tent, the scent of ozone and fear thick in the air. Her eidetic memory unspooled the truth with searing, undeniable clarity. It wasn't Croft on the radio. It was her. Her voice, young and strained but steady, relaying the real-time atmospheric data from her team's advanced sensors. It was Fire Chief Miller, his voice raw with exhaustion, confirming her coordinates and making the rerouting call based on her intelligence. She remembered the call sign of the bus, the frantic gratitude in the driver's voice, the collective sigh of relief that had rippled through the tent. Croft wasn't in a command center. His own internal memos, which she had seen before they were scrubbed, proved he was in a helicopter being evacuated to his estate upstate. The lie was so blatant, so audacious, it stole the air from Ilara's lungs. The water pitcher in her hand suddenly felt as heavy as a block of lead. A decade of suppressed fury, of silent grief for her brother, of the burning injustice of it all, coalesced into a single, solid point of ice in her chest. The invisible waitress, the ghost in the machine, began to solidify into something real, something dangerous. The decision was no longer a choice, it was an inevitability. The fragile illusion of the gilded spire shattered into a million silent pieces, each one reflecting the audacious lie that hung in the air. For a single suspended moment, Alara Vance was frozen, not by fear, but by the sheer, crystalline audacity of Julian Croft's words. The weight of the silver water pitcher in her hand seemed to increase tenfold, anchoring her to a spot on the plush carpet that suddenly felt like the epicenter of a seismic event. The carefully constructed symphony of the restaurant, the clinking of cutlery, the hushed conversations, faded into a dull, distant roar, like the sound of the ocean heard from inside a seashell. All she could hear was the echo of his voice, smooth and practiced, claiming her memory, her actions, her very history as his own. A cold fire, banked for 10 long years, began to smolder in the pit of her stomach, its heat spreading not with the quick flash of anger, but with the slow, deliberate intensity of molten steel. Her eidetic memory, her constant, unwelcome companion, played the truth on a loop behind her eyes. The frantic crackle of the radio, the smell of ozone, and fear in the command tent. Her own voice, steady and clear, relaying the atmospheric data that had saved those children. The dissonance between that reality and the fiction Croft was weaving was so profound, so jarring, it felt like a physical violation, a theft of a part of her soul she thought she had buried long ago. A war raged within her during that long, silent second. One part of her, the pragmatic survivor who counted every dollar for her brother's medication, screamed at her to remain invisible. It was the voice of 10 years of submission, the voice that had learned to swallow pride, to endure condescension, to become a ghost in exchange for a paycheck that kept her brother alive. It reminded her of the towering pile of medical bills on their small kitchen table, of the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator that was the constant soundtrack of their lives. To speak now would be to detonate the fragile stability she had fought so hard to maintain. It would mean the loss of this job, the end of this crucial lifeline. It was a terrifying, paralyzing thought, a vision of absolute ruin that threatened to chain her feet to the floor and seal her lips forever. This voice whispered that her truth was a luxury she could not afford, that her history was a small price to pay for her brother's next breath. It begged her to let it go, to let the lie stand, to simply turn and walk away, retreating back into the shadows where it was safe, where the titans of the world could not crush her under the weight of their self-serving narratives. But then, another image rose to overwhelm the voice of fear, an image more powerful than any threat of poverty or unemployment. It was the face of her brother Leo, not as he was now, pale and tethered to a machine, but as he was before the Viridian Cascade. He was 16, his face bright with the easy confidence of youth, his lungs strong as he laughed, a sound that used to fill their tiny apartment with warmth. Her memory supplied the devastating contrast, superimposing the image of him from last night, his body racked with a coughing fit so violent it left him gasping, his eyes filled with a weary pain that cut her deeper than any insult. Croft's lie was not just an act of stolen valor, it was a grotesque dance on the grave of her brother's health. He was building a monument to his own ego, on a foundation of her family's suffering. The rage that had been a cold ember now erupted into a white-hot inferno. It burned away the fear, the pragmatism, the years of practiced invisibility. It was a clarifying fire, forging her resignation into a diamond-hard resolve. In that instant, she understood that silence was no longer survival. It was complicity. To stay quiet now would be the ultimate betrayal of the boy whose every breath was a testament to Croft's true legacy. The transformation was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but profound. The slight slump of the service worker, a posture of deference honed over years, evaporated. Her spine straightened, her shoulders squared, and she seemed to grow an inch taller. Her grip on the heavy silver pitcher, which had felt like an anchor, now felt like a scepter, her knuckles no longer white with tension but firm with purpose. Her breathing, which had hitched in her chest, became slow, deep, and controlled, each inhalation drawing in strength, each exhalation pushing out the last vestiges of doubt. She raised her head, and for the first time that evening, she allowed her gaze to fall directly upon Julian Croft, not as a waitress looking at a customer, but as an expert assessing an amateur. Her eyes, which had been carefully neutral and downcast, were now alight with a cold, focused intelligence that was utterly devoid of fear. The ghost in the black uniform was gone. In her place stood Alara Vance, the crisis manager, the woman who had walked through a chemical fire and brought 207 people out with her. She was no longer a part of the scenery, she was the scene. The world had forced her to be invisible, and she was about to remind it, and the man at its center, just how much a person you refuse to see is capable of. She took a single, deliberate step forward. The soft leather of her service shoe made an almost imperceptible sound on the thick, opulent carpet. Yet it seemed to echo in the sudden, expectant hush that had fallen over the corner of the restaurant. The reporters, sensing a shift in the room's energy, paused their writing. A cameraman, his instincts honed, subtly shifted his lens, widening the frame to include the approaching waitress. Julian Croft, still basking in the warm glow of his fabricated heroism, had not yet noticed her. He was smiling at the lead reporter, a picture of solemn sincerity, his guard completely down. Alara's movement was not aggressive or hurried. It was the measured, confident advance of someone who knew the terrain and held the superior position. She moved past the corner of the table, placing herself just within the periphery of the camera lights, a position that would make it impossible for them to cut her out of the shot. She stopped, a perfect stillness descending upon her, and waited for the precise moment when Croft finished his sentence, ensuring her interruption would be clean, clear, and impossible to ignore. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the quiet before a lightning strike. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It did not need to be. It was perfectly modulated, a calm, clear alto that sliced through the reverent atmosphere of the gilded spire with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It carried no trace of anger or accusation, only the unshakable authority of fact. "Excuse me, Mr. Croft," she said, the words simple, polite, yet utterly devastating in their context. But that's incorrect. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The lead reporter's jaw went slack, her pen frozen mid-word. Her colleagues turned as one, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning, voracious interest. The low murmur of the restaurant died completely, replaced by a thick, heavy silence. Even the city outside the vast windows seemed to hold its breath. Julian Croft's practiced smile faltered, then vanished. He turned his head slowly. His eyes, which had slid over her a dozen times without seeing her, were now forced to focus, to truly look at the woman in the simple black uniform who had dared to contradict him on live television. For a moment his expression was one of pure, uncomprehending annoyance, the look of a king whose sermon has been interrupted by a peasant. He simply could not process the reality of what was happening. Before he could formulate a response, before his PR-trained mind could spin this interruption into some kind of staged event, Alara continued, her voice remaining level, almost conversational, as if she were discussing the weather rather than dismantling a man's entire public persona. She did not look at the reporters. Her gaze remained locked on Croft, pinning him in place. "You weren't on the comms during the rerouting of school bus 739er, she stated, the specific call sign landing in the silent room with the force of a gavel. You weren't in the command center. In fact, you weren't even in the city." Each sentence was a carefully placed explosive charge, laid at the foundation of his lie. She saw the flicker of panic in his eyes, the first crack in the marble facade. He opened his mouth to protest, to dismiss her, but she gave him no room, her pacing deliberate and relentless, her command of the situation absolute. She was no longer a waitress, she was a prosecutor, and this opulent restaurant had just become her courtroom. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, It had been completely inverted in the space of 10 seconds. The reporters were now in a frenzy of silent activity. Phones were being discreetly raised, recording. Pens flew across notepads, capturing every word. The cameraman had pushed in, his lens now tightly focused on the unfolding drama between the billionaire and the waitress. The rerouting call, Alara continued, her eidetic memory supplying the details with flawless precision, was made at 14:32 hours by Fire Chief Michael Miller. His decision was based on real-time atmospheric data provided by my team, the Viridian Emergency Response Group, which projected a 74% probability of the plume shifting southeast directly into the path of the elementary school's dismissal route. The critical transmission confirming the bus's new coordinates came from me. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the stunned silence of the room. She was not just correcting him. She was providing a detailed, verifiable account, a narrative so rich with specific, technical detail that it carried the undeniable ring of truth. She was replacing his vague, emotional fiction with cold, hard, operational fact, and in doing so, she was erasing him from the very history he had tried to claim as his own. She then delivered the final, devastating blow, turning her attention slightly to the lead reporter, including her in the indictment. Mr. Croft's internal logs, which his own company submitted in the initial inquiry before they were sealed, show that at 14:32 hours, he was aboard his private helicopter, call sign November Charlie 17, en route to his estate in the Hamptons. The mention of the helicopter call sign was a masterstroke, a detail so specific and obscure that it could only be known by someone who was there, someone with access to the official records. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd of assistants and reporters. She had not only exposed his lie about being a hero, she had revealed him as a coward who had fled the city while others stayed to fight the disaster he had created. She had taken his carefully crafted image, the product of millions of dollars in public relations, and shattered it with nothing more than the simple, unadorned truth. The philanthropic mask was gone, and what was left was the ugly, panicked face of a fraud. Julian Croft's composure finally, irrevocably shattered. The color drained from his face, replaced by a blotchy, furious red. The benevolent titan of industry vanished, and in his place was a cornered animal, lashing out with pure, undiluted rage. His voice, when he found it, was no longer the smooth, measured baritone of the interview, but a raw, strangled shriek of narcissistic injury. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" he snarled, his body trembling with fury. He shot to his feet, knocking his chair backward with a loud crash that echoed through the silent restaurant. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara, his eyes blazing with a hatred that was terrifying in its intensity. "You're a waitress, a nobody. You serve water." He wasn't even attempting to refute her claims anymore. He was incapable of it. His only recourse was to attack her status, to try and diminish her, to remind everyone in the room of the vast chasm in their social standing, as if that alone could invalidate the truth she had spoken. But it was too late. His outburst only served to confirm her quiet authority, his hysteria a stark contrast to her unshakable calm. He whirled on the restaurant manager, a portly man named Mr. Dubois, who was now hurrying toward the table, his face ashen with panic and fear. "Dubois!" Croft bellowed, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Get this thing out of my sight. Get her out of my restaurant. She's fired. Do you hear me? Fired." The manager, caught between the wrath of one of his most powerful patrons and the unfolding media disaster, began to stammer apologies, his hands fluttering nervously. He turned to Alara, his eyes pleading with her, begging her to undo what she had done. But Alara did not look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on Croft, her expression unreadable. She had known this was the inevitable outcome. She had made a calculated choice, and she was prepared for the consequences. In her mind, the loss of this job was a small price to pay for the reclamation of her own story, and the first crack in the fortress of lies that had protected Julian Croft for a decade. The chaos erupting around her felt distant, inconsequential. The only thing that mattered was the look in Croft's eyes, the pure, unadulterated terror of a man who had just realized the ghost he thought he had buried had come back to haunt him. Two burly security guards, summoned by the panicked manager, moved toward Alara. They were hesitant, their expressions confused, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. She saved them the trouble. With a final, lingering look at the man she had just publicly destroyed, a look that held not triumph, but a kind of grim satisfaction, she turned away. She placed the silver water pitcher carefully on a nearby service stand, her movement still precise and unhurried. Then, without a word, she began to walk toward the exit. The reporters, who had been momentarily stunned by Croft's outburst, now snapped back into action. Their loyalty was not to the billionaire who fed them press releases, but to the story, and Alara was now the biggest story in the city. A cacophony of questions erupted as they scrambled after her, ignoring Croft's continued, impotent screaming. "Miss, what's your name? Can you prove what you said? Who are you?" They swarmed around her, a chaotic sea of microphones and flashing cameras, their hunger for the truth a palpable force. As she was escorted through the restaurant, the other patrons stared, their billion-dollar deals and political maneuverings forgotten. They were witnessing something far more compelling. A raw, unfiltered moment of rebellion, a takedown of one of their own by someone they had been trained their entire lives to ignore. Alara kept her head held high, her path resolute. She didn't feel shame or fear. Instead, a strange and powerful sense of liberation washed over her. For 10 years, she had carried the weight of the truth in silence, a burden that had bent but not broken her. Now, it was finally out, a force of nature unleashed upon the world, and she felt lighter than she had in a decade. She had lost her job, her only source of income, and her future was a terrifying blank slate. But as the heavy, gold-plated doors of the Gilded Spire swung shut behind her, she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she had just won the most important battle of her life. She had traded her invisibility for her voice, and it was a bargain she would make again without a moment's hesitation. The cold, late autumn air of the Manhattan street hit her like a slap, a stark contrast to the rarefied atmosphere of the restaurant. The sounds of the city rushed in to fill the silence. The blare of taxi horns, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of the evening crowds. For a moment, the sheer enormity of what she had done threatened to overwhelm her. The adrenaline began to fade, and the cold reality of her situation started to creep in. She was unemployed, standing on a street corner in a service uniform, with a sick brother at home who depended on her for everything. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she leaned against the cold stone of the building for support, closing her eyes. The crowd of reporters was still clamoring around her, their questions a meaningless buzz in her ears. Despair, a familiar old enemy, began to whisper at the edges of her mind, telling her that her moment of defiance had been a foolish, reckless act of self-destruction. She had spoken her truth, but what would that truth get her tomorrow when the rent was due and the pharmacy bill arrived? Just as the weight of her decision threatened to crush her, a new voice cut through the noise, different from the others. It was younger, less aggressive, more inquisitive. "Miss Vance? Alara Vance?" She opened her eyes. A young man had pushed his way to the front of the pack. He was maybe in his late 20s, with a rumpled suit, glasses that were slightly askew, and a reporter's notebook clutched in his hand like a lifeline. He looked hungry, but not in the predatory way the others did. He looked like he was hungry for the story, not just the headline. "My name is Ben Carter," he said, his voice earnest. "I'm with the Chronicle. I was an intern on the city desk 10 years ago when the Viridian story broke. I remember your firm's name, was in the initial reports, and then it just disappeared." He was looking at her with an expression of intense curiosity and, more importantly, of belief. He wasn't asking if she was telling the truth. He was asking for the rest of it. That single quiet expression of validation was the lifeline she needed. It was the first time in a decade that someone from the outside world had acknowledged her existence, her role in that history. It was a simple act, but it felt like a dam breaking inside her. The story she had held back, the full, ugly, unvarnished truth of the Viridian Cascade began to surface, not just as a collection of painful memories, but as a weapon. She looked at Ben Carter, at his eager, intelligent eyes, and saw not a reporter, but a potential ally, a conduit. She realized in that moment that simply correcting the record about a school bus was not enough. It was never enough. That was just the tip of the iceberg, the public face of a much deeper, more sinister crime. The real story wasn't about stolen valor, it was about criminal negligence. It was about the safety upgrades Croft had personally vetoed to save a few $1 million. The internal warnings from engineers that he had ignored. The cheap materials used in the containment tanks that had failed so catastrophically. A memory, sharp and sudden, flashed in her mind. It was from the chaotic days after the disaster, just before her firm was dissolved under a mountain of legal pressure from Croft Holdings. She remembered the frantic rush to back up their data, the fear that Croft's legal team would seize and bury everything. On a desperate impulse, late one night in their abandoned office, she had made a full data clone of their central server, a perfect bit-for-bit copy of every email, every report, every budget proposal, every ignored safety warning. She had copied it onto a small, encrypted hard drive, which she had then taken home and thrown into a box of old college textbooks, a relic of a life that no longer existed. For 10 years it had sat in the back of her closet, forgotten. A digital time capsule containing the evidence that could not just ruin Julian Croft's reputation, but could send him to prison. This was no longer about setting the record straight, this was about justice. A cold, calculated, and long overdue justice for her brother, and for every other life that had been shattered by Croft's greed. Alara pushed herself off the wall, her brief moment of weakness gone, replaced by a new and formidable strength. The despair had vanished, burned away by the incandescent light of a new purpose. She looked past Ben Carter, at the glittering tower that housed the gilded spire, at the world of power and privilege that had tried to erase her. They had taken her career, her family's health, and her peace of mind. They had left her with nothing, and in doing so, they had made a fatal error. They had left her with nothing to lose. She turned her gaze back to the young reporter, and for the first time that day, a small, dangerous smile touched her lips. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low and steady, imbued with a newfound authority. "The story you think you're chasing is just the beginning. The real story is much bigger. Meet me tomorrow. I have something to show you." With that, she turned and walked away, melting into the New York crowd, leaving a stunned group of reporters and one very intrigued young journalist in her wake. The waitress was gone. The huntress had just been born. The diner Ben Carter chose was a world away from the gilded spire, a relic of a bygone New York nestled between a laundromat and a pawn shop. The air inside was thick, with the comforting, greasy aroma of frying bacon and old coffee, a scent that clung to the cracked red vinyl of the booths and the worn linoleum floor. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a stark, honest glare that left no room for the soft, flattering illusions of Croft's world. It was a place of grit and survival, a place where truth felt more at home. Alara slid into a booth, the vinyl cool against her skin, and wrapped her hands around the thick ceramic mug of coffee Ben had already ordered for her. Her own hands were still trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the lingering adrenaline of a decade of suppressed rage finally being unleashed. She felt hollowed out and electrified all at once, a vessel scoured clean and now waiting to be filled with a new, dangerous purpose. Across from her, Ben leaned forward, his notepad open, his pen poised, but his eyes were what held her. They were not the eyes of a predator sniffing out a scandal, but those of an archivist who had just stumbled upon a lost chapter of history. She began to speak, her voice low and even, the calm of the storm's eye. She didn't recount the story with the dramatic flair of a victim seeking pity. She laid it out with the cold, methodical precision of a crisis manager delivering a post-action report. She detailed the sequence of events, the specific failures of the containment system, the exact moment the plume had breached the primary vessel. She used technical terms, acronyms, and operational call signs that painted a picture so vivid and irrefutable that it left no room for doubt. She told him about her team, the brilliant engineers and meteorologists who had worked themselves to the point of collapse in that chaotic tent, their efforts entirely erased from the official narrative. She explained how Croft's legal team had descended like vultures, armed with non-disclosure agreements and threats of endless litigation, systematically dismantling her firm and silencing anyone who knew the truth. As she spoke, she watched Ben's expression shift from intense curiosity to dawning horror, and finally to a quiet, simmering anger on her behalf. He was no longer just a reporter. He was a witness, an initiate into the truth she had carried alone for so long. Then, she leaned in closer, the clatter of plates from the kitchen fading into the background. The core of her purpose was not just to reclaim her own story, but to deliver a justice that had been denied for 10 agonizing years. She spoke of her brother, Leo, not by name, but as a living symbol of the human cost of Croft's greed. She described the insidious nature of the toxins released that day, the slow, cruel way they settled into the lungs of the unsuspecting, turning the very act of breathing into a daily struggle. She made Ben understand that the disaster hadn't ended when the chemical cloud dissipated. It was still unfolding, every single day, in the quiet rooms of families like hers, marked by the rhythmic hiss of oxygen machines and the crushing weight of medical debt. It was here that she finally allowed a sliver of the raw emotion she kept so tightly controlled to enter her voice, a razor's edge of fury that made the young reporter sit back slightly, as if he could feel the heat of it. This was not about a stolen moment of glory. It was about a lifetime of stolen health, a future stolen from a boy who had done nothing wrong. She saved the most critical piece for last, the key that would unlock the entire conspiracy. She told him about the hard drive. She described the chaotic final days of her firm, the scent of fear and defeat in their stripped-bare office as Croft's corporate lawyers circled. She recounted the late-night impulse, a desperate act of preservation, when she had cloned their entire central server. Every email, every internal memo, every ignored safety report, every budget proposal, where Croft himself had personally redlined the funds for the upgraded safety valves that would have prevented the entire catastrophe. She explained that this data was not just a refutation of his heroic narrative, it was a detailed, time-stamped indictment of criminal negligence. It was the kind of evidence that didn't just end careers, but that put men like Julian Croft behind bars. As she said the words, she saw the final piece click into place for Ben. The scale of the story he had stumbled upon was no longer just a local news item. It was a national bombshell, a story that could redefine the very meaning of corporate responsibility. His hand, which had been flying across his notepad, now stopped. He looked at her, his eyes wide with the enormity of it all. "Where is it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Where is that drive?" The journey back to her apartment in Queens felt like a descent into another reality, a crossing of a vast, invisible border that separated the glittering spires of Manhattan from the weary, resilient heart of the city. The sterile, air-conditioned silence of the subway gave way to the cacophony of her neighborhood, a vibrant tapestry of languages, the smell of street food, and the rumble of the elevated train overhead. Her building was old, the brickwork tired, the lobbies smelling faintly of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered with a weary rhythm, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the steady, unwavering ambition of the city across the river. This was her world, a world of making ends meet, of patching things up, of quiet endurance. Each creak of the floorboards under her feet, each scuff mark on the wall, was a testament to a life lived on the margins of the world Julian Croft commanded, a life he had unknowingly and carelessly shattered. This humble building, this overlooked corner of the city, was now the unlikely headquarters for the war she was about to wage against him. She let herself into the apartment as quietly as possible, the familiar click of the lock sounding unnaturally loud in the evening stillness. The first thing that always greeted her was the sound, the gentle, rhythmic hiss and puff of the oxygen concentrator in her brother's room. It was the constant, metronomic heartbeat of their lives, a sound that was both a comfort and a curse, a reminder that he was alive, but also a constant testament to why his life was so constrained. She peeked into his room. Leo was asleep, his face pale in the soft glow of his bedside lamp, the thin plastic cannula resting just below his nose. His chest rose and fell with a shallow, labored rhythm that sent a familiar pang of mingled love and fury through her. She saw the ghost of the vibrant, athletic teenager he had been, his face now etched with a weariness that no 26-year-old should ever know. In that moment, watching him, any lingering doubt she might have had about the path she had chosen was incinerated. The image of Julian Croft's face on the television screen, feigning sorrow, flashed in her mind, a grotesque counterpoint to the quiet, fragile reality of her brother's struggle. This was not for her, it was all for him. Her own room was small and sparse, a monastic cell dedicated to function over comfort. At the back of her closet, behind a row of sensible dark-colored clothes, was a collection of cardboard boxes, a graveyard of her former life. The dust was thick, a fine gray powder that coated everything, and the air smelled of old paper and forgotten time. Her heart began to beat faster, a frantic hammering rhythm against her ribs. What if it wasn't there? The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. It had been 10 years. In a decade of moving apartments twice, of spring cleanings and desperate purges to make space, it was entirely possible she had thrown it out, deeming it a painful relic of a past she needed to forget. A cold sweat broke out on her brow as she pulled the boxes out one by one, her hands growing frantic. She saw her MIT textbooks, their titles on quantum physics and advanced chemical engineering now seeming like messages from a different person, a different lifetime. She saw old photo albums, notes from friends, the detritus of a future that had been stolen from her. The panic was rising, a thick, choking tide in her throat. Had her one act of defiance been for nothing? She reached into the last box, her fingers digging through old college notebooks filled with complex equations and lecture notes. Her hand brushed against something hard and plastic, tucked inside the cover of a dense treatise on thermodynamics. She pulled it out. It was small, black, and utterly unremarkable. A simple external hard drive from a long-gone era of technology. It felt impossibly light in her hand, yet she knew it contained the weight of 1,000 truths, the potential to crush an empire. A wave of relief so profound it made her knees weak washed over her, and she sank back on her heels, clutching the small object to her chest as if it were a sacred relic. For a decade, it had been a symbol of her failure, a dormant reminder of the life and career she had lost. But now, in the dusty silence of her closet, holding it in her hand, she understood its true nature. It was not a relic of the past. It was a key. It was a weapon. It was a promise of a future where the truth would finally, unequivocally have its day. The hunt for the evidence was over. The meticulous work of sharpening it into an unavoidable blade had just begun. The next morning, she met Ben in a small, discreet office in the basement of the Chronicle building. The space was a chaotic hub of journalistic energy, smelling of old newsprint, stale coffee, and the faint hum of servers. Ben introduced her to Keiko Tanaka, the head of the newspaper's digital forensics team. Keiko was a woman who seemed to exist in a state of perpetual, focused intensity, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her fingers moving across a keyboard with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. She looked at the old hard drive Alara placed on her desk with a mixture of professional curiosity and skepticism. 10-year-old encryption on a legacy drive, Keiko said, her voice flat and analytical as she plugged it into a complex array of modern hardware. This could be easy, or it could be a digital fortress. The protocols from back then were a wild west of proprietary algorithms. Alara felt a fresh wave of anxiety. The truth was so close, separated from them only by a wall of obsolete code. The potential for failure at this final hurdle was a terrifying prospect, a chasm that threatened to swallow her whole. The process of cracking the drive was a slow, agonizing siege. Keiko worked with a surgeon's focus, her monitors displaying cascading lines of green and black code, a language that was both foreign and deeply familiar to Alara from her own past. The first few attempts to bypass the security were met with digital walls, error messages flashing in stark, red letters on the screen. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the changing light outside the basement window and the steady delivery of fresh coffee by a nervous-looking Ben. He paced the small office like a caged animal, understanding that the biggest story of his career was trapped inside that small black box. Alara, however, was not content to be a passive observer. She pulled a chair up beside Keiko, her own mind clicking back into a mode it hadn't fully engaged in a decade. She began to recall the specific security software her old firm had used, the name of the company that had designed it, the particular quirks of its architecture. She and Keiko began to work in tandem, a strange and powerful partnership forged in the glow of the monitors, one a master of modern forensics, the other a living archive of the very system they were trying to defeat. The breakthrough came late in the afternoon, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet, unassuming click. A progress bar that had been stalled for over an hour suddenly filled, and a new window opened on the screen, displaying a simple, neatly organized file directory. For a moment, all three of them just stared, a collective, silent exhalation of breath filling the small room. The digital fortress had been breached. Keiko, with a nod of profound respect to Alara, clicked open the first folder, labeled Croft_com_internal. A list of documents filled the screen, their titles alone, sending a chill down Alara's spine. Viridian Plant, Q3 Safety Upgrade Veto, Internal Memo, Containment Wall Integrity Concerns, Budget Analysis, Project Cost Savings versus Regulatory Compliance. It was all there. Every warning, every corner cut, every decision that had prioritized profit over human life, preserved in perfect, damning digital amber. The abstract concept of Croft's guilt was now staring back at them as a concrete, verifiable, and utterly damning collection of facts. They worked through the night, the small office transformed into a war room. The initial euphoria of discovery was quickly replaced by a grim, methodical focus. With Alara as their guide, they were not just looking at data, they were excavating a crime scene. Her eidetic memory was the connective tissue linking a seemingly innocuous budget spreadsheet from one folder to a panicked engineer's email in another. She remembered the names, the faces, the conversations behind the cold, corporate text on the screen. She pointed to a line item in a financial report, a savings of a mere $2 million. And then cross-referenced it with the email from a senior engineer, a man named George Matheson, who had warned that the cheaper alloy proposed for the containment tanks would not withstand the pressure levels required. She then found the final chilling reply, not from an underling, but from Julian Croft's own email address, a single, dismissive sentence. "The projected risk is acceptable. Proceed." The words were a death sentence, signed and delivered with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he was above consequences. Ben, realizing the need for a human element to corroborate the digital evidence, spent hours on the phone, using the newspaper's resources to track down the current whereabouts of the people named in the documents. Many of the numbers were disconnected, the trails gone cold. But finally, he found him. George Matheson, the engineer who had sent the ignored warning. He was retired now, living a quiet, solitary life in a small town in upstate New York. Ben put him on speakerphone. At first, the old man was terrified, his voice trembling as he spoke of the non-disclosure agreement he had been forced to sign, the threats to his pension that had kept him silent for a decade. But as Alara gently read his own words back to him, the words from the email he had written all those years ago, his fear began to be replaced by a slow-burning, righteous anger. He confirmed everything. He described the meeting where Croft had personally overruled his safety concerns, waving his hand dismissively and calling him an, quote, alarmist. He was their validator, the human voice that would give life to the cold data on the screen, a living witness to the crime. As dawn broke, painting the city skyline in shades of gray and pink, they had it all. A complete, irrefutable timeline of criminal negligence, a treasure trove of internal documents, and a credible witness willing to go on the record. They had the weapon, and it was perfectly forged. But just as they began to discuss the strategy for releasing the information, a news alert flashed across one of the monitors, a cruel twist of fate that was also a perfect opportunity. The headline read, Julian Croft to deliver keynote address at Corporate Responsibility Summit. Croft, in a desperate, audacious attempt to control the narrative and rehabilitate his image after the restaurant incident, was going to stand before the titans of industry and lecture them on ethics. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. Alara looked at Ben, and then at Keiko. A silent, shared understanding passed between them. A newspaper article was not enough. A press conference could be spun or ignored. This crime demanded a more public, more personal, more devastating form of justice. Croft had chosen his stage. They would simply provide the final act. The plan began to form not as a complex conspiracy, but as a simple, elegant strategy of truth. It was a three-pronged attack, each of them with a critical role to play. Ben would use his press credentials to get inside the summit, a legitimate presence in the auditorium. Keiko, with her formidable technical skills, would work remotely, targeting the auditorium's audio-visual system, a digital ghost ready to hijack the entire presentation at a moment's notice. And Alara, she would be the voice. She would be the one to walk onto that stage and deliver the verdict that had been delayed for 10 years. She was no longer just a source or a witness. She was the prosecutor. The final piece of their strategy was to ensure that Croft could not escape, that he would be forced to confront the evidence in front of his peers, the very people whose respect he so desperately craved. The summit was not just a venue, it was a crucible, designed to burn away his lies under the glare of the brightest possible lights. The final hours before the summit were a study in controlled, focused energy. There was no more panic, no more doubt. The weight of the past had been transformed into the fuel for the future. Alara went home, not to rest, but to prepare. She stood before her small closet, pushing past the black waitress uniform that had been her camouflage for so long. She reached for a simple, dark blazer and a crisp white shirt, clothes she hadn't worn in a decade, relics from her former life. As she put them on, it felt like she was donning a suit of armor. She was shedding the skin of the invisible service worker and re-inhabiting the persona of the competent, authoritative professional she had always been. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw not a victim, but a strategist. Her eyes were clear, her expression calm and resolute. She picked up a small, framed photo from her dresser, a picture of her and Leo from years ago, both of them smiling, their faces bright with a future that had not yet been stolen. She held it for a moment, a silent promise passing between the woman in the mirror and the boy in the photograph. The time for hiding was over, the time for justice had arrived. The grand ballroom of the Hilton Midtown was a cathedral of corporate self-congratulation, a cavernous space designed to make powerful men feel even more significant. The air was cool and sterile, smelling of industrial-grade air freshener and the faint, expensive scent of leather from hundreds of briefcases. A massive banner hung behind the stage, bearing the summit's sanctimonious title, Corporate Responsibility in the New Millennium, its letters gleaming under the focused heat of the stage lights. The audience was a sea of dark, tailored suits and muted power ties, a veritable who's who of the Fortune 500. They listened with polite, practiced attention as Julian Croft stood at the podium, his image magnified on two enormous screens that flanked the stage. He was in his element, his voice, a smooth, resonant baritone, weaving a narrative of ethical leadership and compassionate capitalism. He spoke of the heavy burden of command, the moral calculus of decision-making, and the soul-searching that followed a tragedy like the Viridian Cascade. To the uninitiated, he was the very picture of a modern, enlightened leader. But from her position in the darkened wings of the stage, a space smelling of dust and electrical wiring, Ilara Vance saw only a monster polishing his own tombstone. The small, cold weight of the lavalier microphone Ben had slipped her felt like the hilt of a sword in her palm, a conduit for the justice she was about to unleash. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her mind was a sea of absolute calm. She had walked through fire once before. This was merely a stage. Croft was reaching the crescendo of his speech, his voice thick, with a carefully rehearsed emotion that made Ilara's stomach turn. He spoke of the lessons learned, of the phoenix rising from the ashes, a metaphor so grotesquely inappropriate it was a desecration of the lives his greed had ruined. He was positioning himself not as a perpetrator, but as a survivor, a wise elder statesman of industry who had stared into the abyss and emerged with profound insights to share. He was receiving a smattering of applause for a particularly hollow platitude about transparency when the world around him began to unravel. It started subtly, a barely perceptible flicker on the massive screens behind him. His confident, smiling face, projected 20 feet high, suddenly dissolved into a brief flash of digital static. He paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features, assuming a minor technical glitch. He tapped the microphone, a condescending smile on his lips as if to reassure the audience that even in moments of imperfection, he was in complete control. But then, the static cleared, and the image that replaced his face was not the summit's logo, but the stark black and white text of an email, its header and signature magnified for the entire auditorium to see. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of confusion and curiosity. Croft turned, his smile faltering as he read his own words from a decade ago, the words that had sentenced hundreds to a lifetime of suffering. The projected risk is acceptable. Proceed. The auditorium, which had been filled with the low hum of polite attention, fell into a silence so profound it was like a physical pressure. The only sound was the faint whir of the ventilation system. Julian Croft stood frozen at the podium, his back to the audience, staring at the ghost of his own damnation. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, sallow pallor. His mind, usually so quick to spin, to deflect, to control, was utterly blank. This was an impossibility, a nightmare made manifest. The email was followed by another document, a page from a budget proposal, with the line item for containment tank safety upgrades circled in red, a bold, arrogant veto scrawled next to it in his own handwriting. Keiko's work was flawless, the documents scrolled with a slow, deliberate pace, each one a nail being hammered into his corporate coffin. The audience was no longer just murmuring. Phones were being raised, their small red recording lights winking on like a field of malevolent fireflies. The faces in the front row, the faces of his peers, his rivals, his allies, were masks of cold, calculating shock. They were not seeing a colleague in trouble. They were witnessing a liability being exposed, a wounded gazelle being separated from the herd, and their predatory instincts were taking over. Croft was no longer one of them. He was a spectacle, a cautionary tale, a threat to their collective stability. It was into this thick, suffocating silence that Ilara Vance walked. Her footsteps on the polished stage floor were the only sound in the vast room, each one a deliberate, measured beat, counting down the final seconds of Julian Croft's reign. The spotlight operator, acting on pure journalistic instinct, swung the beam away from the disgraced CEO and found her as she reached the center of the stage. She was not dressed for a gala. Her simple dark blazer and white shirt were the uniform of a professional, not a performer. She looked directly out at the sea of powerful faces, her own expression unreadable, her gaze sweeping over them without fear or deference. She saw Ben in the third row, his face pale but his eyes alight with a fierce, triumphant pride. She took the spare microphone from its stand, the metal cool and solid in her hand. She did not look at Croft, who remained a statue of ruin by the podium, but she could feel the heat of his panicked, hate-filled stare. In her mind's eye, she saw her brother Leo, not as he was now, but as he was before, laughing and full of life. That image was her shield, her strength, the pure, unassailable core of her purpose. The waitress was gone. The crisis manager had returned to take command. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the clear alto from the restaurant. It was amplified now, filling every corner of the vast ballroom, yet it retained its chilling calm, its absolute, factual authority. "Good afternoon," she began, as if she were opening a board meeting. "My name is Hilaire Vance. For the past 10 years, Julian Croft has told the world a story about the Viridian Cascade. Today, I am here to tell you the truth." She paused, letting the weight of her presence settle. The document you see on the screen is an internal memo from Croft Holdings, dated 10 months before the disaster. In it, senior engineer George Matheson warned Mr. Croft that the containment tanks, made from a cheaper alloy to save the company $2 million, had a 35% chance of catastrophic failure under peak operational pressure. She gestured toward the screen, where Keiko had perfectly timed the display of that very memo. Mr. Croft's response, as you have already seen, was to accept that risk. He gambled with the lives of an entire community to improve his quarterly earnings report. And he lost. Each sentence was a perfectly placed stone, building an unshakable foundation of irrefutable fact. She was not making an accusation. She was delivering a verdict that was a decade overdue. She continued, her voice never wavering, her pacing relentless. She walked the audience through the chain of negligence. Her eidetic memory, a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. She connected the budget cuts to the faulty alarms, the ignored warnings to the insufficient safety protocols, the corporate greed to the human cost. She was dismantling him piece by piece, not with emotion, but with the cold, hard logic of causality. The titans of industry in the audience were captivated, horrified, and secretly, deeply impressed. This was a language they understood. This was not a plea for sympathy. It was a masterful, hostile takeover of a man's entire legacy, executed in public with devastating efficiency. Then, when she had laid the corporate crime bare for all to see, she made it personal. She pressed a small button on a remote in her hand, and the documents on the screen vanished. They were replaced by a single, high-resolution photograph. It was a recent picture of her brother Leo sitting in a chair by a window, the plastic cannula of his oxygen tube, a permanent fixture on his pale face. His eyes, weary but defiant, seemed to look out and accuse every single person in that room. "This is my brother Leo," Ilara said, her voice softening for the first time, not with weakness but with a profound, aching love that was more powerful than any rage. He was 16 years old when the Viridian Cascade happened. He was a soccer player. He was going to be an architect. Now, his lungs are so scarred by the toxins Mr. Croft deemed an acceptable risk that he cannot walk up a flight of stairs. The $2 million that Julian Croft saved is a debt my brother pays with every single breath he takes, every day, for the rest of his life. He is the true legacy of Viridian. He and the hundreds of others like him. He is the human cost of the corporate responsibility you are all here to celebrate. She let her words hang in the air, a final, damning indictment. She then placed the microphone carefully back in its stand and looked, for the first and last time, directly at Julian Croft. His face was a horrifying mask of sweat and terror, his carefully constructed world having crumbled to dust around him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a king stripped bare in his own court, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. The silence stretched for a moment longer, and then the room erupted. Type "Justice" in the comments if you got chills when Ilara finally exposed the truth. The aftermath was swift and absolute. As news alerts began to flash on every phone in the ballroom announcing a federal criminal investigation into Croft Holdings, the illusion of collegial support evaporated. CEOs who had shaken Croft's hand an hour earlier now turned their backs on him, whispering urgently to their aides, their faces grim masks of self-preservation. He was no longer a peer. He was a contagion, and they were all desperate to prove their immunity. He was escorted from the stage by Summit Security, a shell of a man, his eyes vacant, his multi-thousand-dollar suit looking like a cheap costume. His downfall was not a dramatic explosion, but a cold, silent, and unanimous excommunication from the world he had fought so ruthlessly to dominate. Alara watched none of it. She slipped back through the wings, met by a jubilant Ben, and they walked out of the building together, leaving the chaos behind them, stepping out into the clean, ordinary air of the city. Her war was over. She had not only reclaimed her story, she had delivered justice for her brother, and in doing so, had found a peace that had eluded her for a decade. 6 months later, Alara Vance stood looking out the floor-to-ceiling window of a new office. It was not a gilded cage suspended above the city, but a clean, modern space in a building known for its ethical investments and sustainable design. The view was of Central Park, a sprawling expanse of green and life that felt a world away from the cold ambition of the financial district. After the summit, she had been approached by Sarah Chen, the CEO of a rival corporation who had been in the front row, a woman who had seen not an act of revenge, but an act of profound courage and brilliant strategic thinking. She had offered Alara not just a job, but a mission: to build and lead a new, fully funded division of corporate ethics and crisis response, a department with the power to investigate and intervene, to be the internal voice of conscience that companies like Croft Holdings had so ruthlessly silenced. It was a position that gave her the resources to ensure Leo received the best medical care in the country at a specialized facility in Arizona where the dry air was a balm to his damaged lungs. More than that, it gave her a platform to ensure that what happened at Viridian would never happen again under her watch. She smiled as her laptop chimed, signaling an incoming video call. Leo's face appeared on the screen, and the sight of it sent a familiar, joyful warmth through her. He was no longer pale and tethered to a machine. He was sitting on a sun-drenched patio, the clear blue of the desert sky behind him. He was breathing easily, deeply, a simple act that was the greatest victory of all. He had started taking online architecture classes, his old dream rekindled, his future no longer defined by the limits of his lungs, but by the boundlessness of his own talent. They talked for an hour, not about the past, but about the future, his designs, her new projects, the quiet, ordinary, wonderful things that made up a life. As she ended the call, she looked back out at the view. She had learned that true power wasn't about inhabiting the highest tower or having the loudest voice. It was about integrity, the one currency that could not be bought or faked. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and erased, but she had held onto the one thing that mattered, the truth. And in the end, it had not only set her free, it had allowed her to build a new world for herself and her family, one founded not on lies, but on the unshakable bedrock of justice. If Alara's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.